"That little cabin out on Route 9, Victor said. "It isn't even worth the gas money to drive there. Leave it. She can have it." No one at the table argued. The papers kept moving. A pen clicked. A legal folder closed. Frank Calloway's life was being divided into columns, signatures, and quiet decisions made by people who believed the important things were already gone. Dorothy Calloway reached for the single folded deed that had been left at the edge of the table. 1 page, $1. One forgotten cabin on a dirt road nobody had visited in years. She read it once, folded it carefully, and slid it into the pocket of her cardigan. She did not look at Victor. She did not speak. She simply stood up and walked to the door. Dorothy had been part of the Calloway family for 31 years. She had nursed Frank through 2 surgeries, sat beside him through every hard year, and loved him in the quiet, unglamorous way real marriages are actually built. The week Frank died, his family took the house, the cars, the investment accounts, and everything in the safe. They left her the $1 cabin. What Victor Calloway did not know was that Frank had spent 3 years making sure the one piece of land his family would never look at twice was the only one that mattered. Victor was a property developer. He knew what land was worth. But he forgot the cabin. Frank was counting on it. Frank Calloway died on a Sunday morning in March in the bedroom of the house on Alderman Drive that he and Dorothy had shared for 26 years. It was just after 6. The light was barely there, that thin, gray light of early spring that hasn't decided yet whether it intends to be morning. Dorothy had been awake for most of the night, sitting in the chair beside the bed, the way she had learned to sit during 30 years of nursing, present, attentive, conserving her own energy without ever fully letting go of her awareness. She had held his hand. She had talked to him softly when he seemed to need it and been quiet when quiet was better. At some point the breathing changed. She had heard that change many times in her career in hospital rooms and hospice wards and the occasional home visit. She knew what it meant. She moved to the edge of the bed and took both his hands in hers and stayed there until it was over. Then she sat for a long time in the gray morning light and let herself be still. She called Victor at 7:15. She was direct and clear the way she had always been direct and clear, the habit of a woman who had spent decades delivering difficult information to families in hospital corridors and had learned that clarity in those moments is its own form of kindness. Victor arrived on Tuesday. He came with a folder, a notary, and a probate attorney named Gerald Marsh, who had the compact efficiency of a man who does this work regularly and has long since made peace with its emotional weight. They arrived together, which told Dorothy that the logistics of this visit had been arranged before Frank's death, not out of malice necessarily, but out of the forward planning of a man like Victor, who moved through the world with the brisk certainty of someone who believes that preparation and control are essentially the same thing. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table. She had sat at a table with Frank every morning for 31 years, and at this one for the last 26. She and Frank had eaten breakfast here, eggs on weekdays, something more elaborate on Sundays, coffee always the paper shared between them, in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill every moment with words. The table had a water ring near one edge from a summer years ago when Frank had set a glass down without a coaster, and she had teased him about it for a week, and he had laughed and said he'd fix it and never had. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and waited. Gerald Marsh opened his folder with the practiced motion of a man who has done this thousands of times. He spoke clearly without unnecessary preamble. The will had been signed in 2020. It had been properly witnessed and notarized. He walked her through it section by section with the professional courtesy of someone who is delivering information rather than making an argument. The primary residence on Alderman Drive to Victor, its contents, furnishings, and appurtenances to Victor. The 2 investment properties on the east side of the county to the Calloway Family Trust, administered by Victor as trustee. The joint checking account and savings account released to the estate for distribution. The brokerage account to the trust. The vehicles, both of them, the truck and the sedan, titled to the estate and transferred to Victor as executor pending final distribution. Dorothy read along on her copy. She had spent 30 years reading patient charts and medication dosages and legal consent forms at 2 in the morning. She was not intimidated by documents. She read carefully the way she did everything, and she noted what was there and what was not. She received a life insurance policy of $15,000 and a 90-day right to remain in the guest cottage on the property before it reverted to the estate. The house, the cars, the accounts, the investments, 31 years of a shared life divided into line items and transferred in the space of a Tuesday morning. She looked up at Gerald Marsh when he finished. She asked one question, her voice even. "Is there anything in my name?" Gerald Marsh checked his documentation with the slight pause of a man who has not been asked this question and is returning to materials he considered secondary. He found it after a moment a deed separate from the estate documents filed with the county. Route 9 property, he said, transferred to Dorothy Ann Calloway in May of 2017. Consideration of $1. He slid it across the table toward her. Victor glanced at it from where he stood by the kitchen counter. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has already been assessed and dismissed. He waved one hand, a small, casual gesture, the gesture of someone waving a point too minor to argue. "That old shack, take it." Dorothy picked up the deed. She read it once the way she had read the other documents, carefully, completely, without rushing. Then she folded it along its center crease and slid it into the pocket of her cardigan. She noticed something as she folded it. In the bottom margin of the deed, below the formal language, and the notary seal and Frank's signature written in ink slightly different from the rest of the document, smaller added by hand 4 numbers. She almost missed them. They were not typed, not part of the official document. Frank had written them himself in the precise handwriting of a man who had spent 35 years keeping meticulous records. She did not know what they meant. She folded the deed over the numbers without letting her expression change. Sylvia arrived that evening. She came through the front door with the proprietary ease of someone who has decided that a place already belongs to them, canvas tote over one shoulder, notepad in hand, moving through the rooms with the quiet focus of someone conducting an inventory. Dorothy watched from the kitchen doorway. When Sylvia reached the windowsill in the living room, she picked up the small ceramic blue bird, the one Dorothy had bought at a roadside stand on their honeymoon, $4 slightly imperfect glaze, 31 years on that sill. This was Frank's mother's, Sylvia said. It should stay in the family. She placed it in her bag and moved on. Dorothy knew it wasn't. She had been present when Frank's mother's estate was settled. The bluebird had not come from that house. It had never belonged to anyone but Dorothy. She said nothing. She stood in the doorway and watched Sylvia move to the next room, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not defeat, not resignation, but the quiet, durable clarity of a woman who now understood exactly what she was dealing with, and had decided without drama what she intended to do about it. She left the house that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a paper bag of kitchen items Gerald Marsh told her she was permitted to take. She drove 40 minutes to her sister Jean's house in the next county. The March landscape moved past her windows, bare fields, bare trees, the flat gray sky of a season not yet ready to become something warmer. She did not turn on the radio. She kept thinking about the 4 numbers in the margin of the deed, small, handwritten, added in ink that was slightly different from the rest of the document, as if written at a different time after the formal paperwork was already complete. Added deliberately by a man who did not do things without purpose. Frank had transferred that cabin to her name for $1. $1 on a deed he had taken the time to sign before a notary and file with the county. Victor had looked at it for 3 seconds and waved it away like a footnote. But Frank had been a real estate investor for 35 years. He had built his entire life's work on the understanding that the value of land was never simply what it appeared to be on the surface. He had said it to her more than once in the quiet way he said the things that mattered. The most important question about a piece of land is never what it's worth today. She thought about that now. She thought about the 4 numbers. She thought about the cabin on Route 9 that nobody had visited in years sitting on its dirt road, while the rest of the estate was divided and distributed and transferred. Frank Calloway did not give anything away. Not land, not numbers, and certainly not a cabin for $1. Dorothy had been practical about grief her entire adult life, not because she was cold, but because she had spent 30 years watching families come apart in hospital waiting rooms and had learned somewhere in all of that falling apart completely was a luxury that the people who most needed to hold things together could rarely afford. She cried in the shower. She functioned everywhere else. Jean's spare room was small and clean, with a quilt on the bed that Dorothy recognized from their mother's house, and a window that looked out over a flat stretch of backyard and a bare-limbed oak tree that was just beginning at its outermost tips to show the faint suggestion of buds. She unpacked her 2 suitcases with the methodical economy of a woman accustomed to making temporary spaces work. She set Frank's photograph on the nightstand. She put her coffee mug in Jean's kitchen cabinet. She made the bed with the quilt's corners tucked the way her mother had taught her, tight and even. Then she sat down at Jean's kitchen table and opened the folder of papers she had managed to bring. The cabin deed, a folder of their joint tax returns going back 7 years, an old insurance document for a car they had replaced 3 years ago, a copy of Frank's business license from 2009 renewal stamped and filed in the precise way Frank filed everything. She went through each item carefully the way a nurse reviews a chart, not hoping for a specific answer, but making sure she understood what was actually there before she decided what to do next. Nothing told her anything useful, not yet. She opened the laptop Jean had set on the table without being asked which was the kind of sister Jean was. She typed in the Route 9 address from the deed. The county property records came up in the flat, functional format of a government database that had been designed for bureaucrats rather than readers. She worked through it patiently. The lot was recorded as a single-structure parcel, a wood-frame structure built in the 1940s, no renovations on record. The land, 22.4 acres. Recorded classification, unimproved rural land. No special designation. No recent appraisal on file. Assessed value, $6,200. She looked at that number for a moment. $6,200. The kind of value that made county assessors shrug and move on. The kind of number that explained immediately why Victor had not bothered. The annual property tax is $214, paid on time every year without exception, going back as far as the records showed. Always paid by Frank. She sat with that detail. 22.4 acres of unimproved rural land taxes paid faithfully every year by a man who never maintained anything carelessly. Frank had not kept that cabin out of sentimentality. Frank did not do anything out of sentimentality. He had kept it and paid for it and transferred it to her name and written 4 numbers in the margin of the deed. She pulled the deed out of the folder and set it beside the laptop. She was still looking at the 2 of them, the deed and the property record, when she reached into the folder one more time and found the birthday card. Last year's. The last birthday Frank had been healthy enough to celebrate properly. They had gone to dinner at the restaurant on the square, the one they had been going to for 20 years, and Frank had ordered the same thing he always ordered and complained about the new menu formatting the way he always complained, and she had laughed at him the way she always laughed, and it had been ordinary. Entirely ordinary. The kind of evening she had not understood while it was happening was a gift. The card was cream-colored simple. Frank had never been a man for elaborate cards. He chose them plain and wrote more inside than most people wrote. She opened it. His handwriting. Neat, deliberate, slightly compressed in the way it had gotten in his later years when his hand had begun to tire more easily. You have always been smarter than they give you credit for. Don't let that change when I'm gone. F. She read it once, then again, then a third time the way you read something when you are not sure if you are reading the words correctly or reading into them. She set the card down beside the deed, and for the first time not as a feeling but as a thought, clear and specific and impossible to put back once it had arrived, she thought he knew. He had known what Victor would do. He had known how the week after his death would go, the attorney, the folder, the 90-day clock, the casual efficiency of a family that had been waiting for a long time for what they considered a correction. He had known all of it. He had been a real estate investor for 35 years, and before that he had watched his own father's estate get picked apart by people who moved fast and looked only at what was in front of them. He had known, and he had planned around it. and he had written her a birthday card that was, she understood now, also a set of instructions. "Don't let that change when I'm gone." Victor called at 2:30. She let it ring twice, not from hesitation, but from the habit of composure she had been practicing her whole life. He was polite. He always managed to be polite, which was its own particular skill. He was calling to let her know as a courtesy that the 90-day timeline for the guest cottage had officially begun as of the date of probate filing. He wanted to make sure she had received the paperwork. He hoped she was doing all right. She thanked him. Then she asked evenly whether she might arrange to retrieve some of her own documents from the filing cabinet in Frank's home office personal records, her own tax documents correspondence. A pause, brief but there. Victor said that Frank's personal files had been secured for the estate review. His attorney would need to assess what qualified as personal property versus estate property before anything could be released. He would be in touch about scheduling. He would be in touch. Dorothy thanked him again and ended the call and set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. 35 years of files. Every property record, every transaction, every carefully organized folder in those 4 gray filing cabinets Frank had kept since before she knew him. Locked away now behind Victor's attorney's review process, which would move at whatever speed Victor needed it to move. She was not going to get into those files. She understood that plainly and without drama. Whatever Frank had left her to find, it was not going to be in anything Victor had already secured. She looked at the deed on the table, at the cabin, at the $6,200 assessed value on the laptop screen, at the 4 numbers in the margin. She took a notepad from Jean's kitchen drawer and wrote them down. She set the pen beside the pad and looked at them. Too short for a phone number, too long for a zip code. She tried to arrange them as a date, the 4th day of May, and a year perhaps, but neither reading resolved into anything meaningful. She tried them as a street address. Nothing on Route 9 matched. She tried them as an account number fragment, which made no sense without context. She was still sitting with the notepad when Jean came in from the backyard with dirt on her hands from the early spring work she'd been doing in the garden, and looked over Dorothy's shoulder at the 4 numbers on the pad. Jean said could be a lockbox combination. Frank used to have one of those old brass padlocks, the kind with a 4-digit dial. Remember, he had one on that storage unit for years. Dorothy went very still. The cabin. She had not been to the Route 9 cabin since the summer of 2019. She tried to remember it clearly, the exterior, the door, the details. A wood-frame structure, small. A covered porch, she thought. And a door with a padlock. An old brass one, the kind with a 4-digit combination dial. She could see it now clearly, the way you see something once you have stopped trying to remember it. Frank had always gone to the cabin alone. Saturday mornings occasionally when she had assumed he was fishing or simply wanted the quiet of a man who has earned the right to a morning by himself. She had never needed to go in. He had always said it was just a storage shed. Old tools, nothing valuable. She looked at the 4 numbers on the notepad. She looked at her car keys on the kitchen counter. The lamp over the table made a small warm circle in the late afternoon light. Outside, the bare oak was losing the last of its color to the coming dark. She had not been to that cabin in nearly 5 years. Frank had kept a padlock on the door, an old brass one, the kind with a 4-digit dial. She had never needed to go in. She looked at the 4 numbers one more time. Then she looked at her keys. The next morning before sunrise, she drove to Route 9. She drove to Route 9 in the dark. Jean had still been asleep when Dorothy came downstairs at 5:30, dressed and practical with her coat already on, and the cabin deed folded in her breast pocket. She left a note on the kitchen table. Gone out early back by noon and took her keys and her thermos of coffee and drove through the last of the night into the slow arrival of a March morning. The county road that became Route 9 was the kind of road that had been important once, and had since been bypassed by everything faster and more direct. It ran through low farmland, past a grain elevator that looked like it hadn't been active in a decade, past a white church with a hand-lettered sign out front, past stretches of scrub pine, and open field that the morning mist was just beginning to lift from. Dorothy had driven this road a handful of times over the years, always with Frank, always in passing. She had never driven it alone. The turnoff for the cabin was a break in the tree line marked by a rusted metal post that might once have held a mailbox. The dirt track beyond it was overgrown at the edges, the tire ruts from old visits still visible, but soft with years of disuse. She drove slowly. The headlights caught the brush on either side, the bare branches, the pale mist settling in the low places. The cabin appeared at the end of the track the way modest things appear when you are looking for them, smaller than memory suggested, more weathered, more honestly itself. Wood frame 1940s construction, the boards gone gray with decades of weather. A tin roof with a rust line along the eave. A covered porch narrow with a single wooden step that had begun to separate from the frame. Brush grown up thick on two sides as though the land was in the slow process of reclaiming it. Dorothy parked and sat for a moment with the engine off. The mist was thin and cold. A bird called somewhere in the tree line one clean note, then silence. The sky above the pines was the particular pale gray of a morning that will eventually be clear, but hasn't committed to it yet. She got out of the car. The padlock was exactly where she had pictured it, a brass combination lock 4-digit dial hung through a heavy steel hasp on the cabin door. Old, but not neglected. The brass was tarnished, but the mechanism was clean, the dial moving smoothly when she touched it with her thumb. Frank had maintained it. Of course he had. She set the thermos on the porch step. She took the deed from her breast pocket and unfolded it to the bottom margin. 4 numbers in Frank's handwriting. She set them into the dial one at a time, turning carefully, feeling the slight click of each number finding its position. When she entered the last one, she pressed the shackle. The lock opened. She stood for a moment with the open lock in her hand. Then she hung it on the hasp, pushed the door inward, and stepped inside. The cabin was one room. Old tools along the left wall, rakes, a post hole digger, a handsaw, a coil of rope on a nail. All of it arranged with the neat intentionality of a man who kept his workspace organized. 2 folding chairs leaned against the far wall. A shelving unit held paint cans, a box of nails, 3 coffee cans with their lids on. Everything had the dusty stillness of a space that had not been actively used in some time, but had been left in order, not abandoned, just waiting. Dorothy stood in the center of the room and looked at it. It was ordinary, completely, entirely ordinary. And then she looked at the workbench. It ran the length of the right wall, a solid construction, heavier than it needed to be, for a simple shed workbench built into the wall with the permanence of something meant to stay. The surface was clean. Not dusty clean, not wiped clean once years ago. Clean in the way a surface is clean when someone has maintained it, has kept it clear, has treated it as a working surface rather than a storage ledge. She crossed the room and crouched down. Beneath the workbench, partially obscured by a piece of scrap plywood leaned against the front face, was a steel box set directly into the concrete floor. Not sitting on it. Set into it, bolted, recessed, the lid flush with the surface around it. A document safe, the kind with a 4-digit combination mechanism built into the lid, the same style of dial as the padlock on the door. She moved the scrap plywood aside. She entered the 4 numbers. The lid released. Inside a manila folder, fat with documents, a sealed envelope cream-colored her name on the front in Frank's handwriting, the same deliberate block letters she had seen on the deed, on birthday cards, on the notes he used to leave on the kitchen counter when he left early for a property visit. And beneath the folder and the envelope, face down, a photograph. She picked up the photograph first. It was the 2 of them. Taken here at this cabin, she could see the porch rail in the background, the tree line beyond it. She was laughing at something off to the side, not looking at the camera. Frank was looking directly at it, and he was laughing too, not the polite, contained expression he wore in family photographs, not the managed smile of a man performing ease for an audience. Really laughing the way he laughed when it was just the 2 of them, when there was no audience to manage and no family dynamic to navigate, and he could simply be the man she had married rather than the man they required him to be. She had never seen this photograph before. She did not remember the day it was taken. He must have printed it himself, must have carried it here to this room, to this lockbox, and placed it face down at the bottom of everything else, so that it would be the last thing she expected, so that when she found the documents and the envelope and the careful architecture of everything he had prepared, she would also find this, just him, laughing in the place he had kept for her. She sat down on the cabin floor. The concrete was cold through her coat. She didn't notice. She held the photograph in both hands and looked at his face, at that particular unguarded version of him that she had been the keeper of for 31 years, and she sat with it for a long time. The manila folder and the sealed envelope and the morning and the mist and the bird, calling somewhere in the pines, all of it quiet around her. She called Jean from the floor of the cabin, the photograph still in her lap. Jean answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the alert quality of someone who had seen the note and been waiting since. Dorothy told her she had found something. A lockbox in the floor, documents, a sealed envelope. Jean said, "What's in the documents?" Dorothy said, "I haven't read them yet." Jean said, "Dorothy Ann Calloway, you open those papers right now." Dorothy looked down at Frank's laughing face in the photograph. She said, "I'm looking at Frank first." A pause. Then Jean said quietly, "Okay, take your time." She opened the manila folder when she was ready. 3 documents. She separated them carefully the way she had always handled things that mattered and set them on the workbench above her. The first was on letterhead. She recognized a legal firm from the county seat, the same firm whose name she had seen on property documents of Frank's over the years. A cover letter dated 14 months ago, addressed to Frank and referencing an enclosed agreement. The second was a property survey. The 22.4 acres of the Route 9 parcel, mapped in full with the lot lines clearly drawn and the acreage labeled. She could see the cabin marked near the front of the property, and behind it the land continuing back much further than she had realized into what the survey notations described as the deeper portion of the parcel. The third document was 22 pages long. At the top, in clean professional type, a company name she did not recognize. Meridian Energy Partners, LLC. Beneath it, a document title, Mineral Rights Lease Agreement Preliminary Terms and Conditions. Dated 14 months ago. She read the first paragraph. It described a parcel of land in the county located on Route 9, 22.4 acres, currently held in the name of Dorothy Ann Calloway as registered owner. It described Meridian Energy Partners as a licensed energy exploration and development company with operations across 4 states. It described the purpose of the agreement as the negotiation of a mineral rights lease for the subsurface mineral deposits identified in the company's preliminary survey of the parcel. She stopped. She read the first paragraph again. She set the document down on the workbench and looked at the far wall of the cabin, at the tools, hanging in their careful order at the coffee cans on the shelf, at the ordinary surface of a place that had been hiding something extraordinary under its floor for years. She said to no one, to the cold, still air of the cabin, to the photograph still in her hand, "Frank, what did you do?" She turned to page 4 of the Meridian document. The lease terms were laid out in the clean, impersonal language of a business agreement, definitions, acreage descriptions, rights, granted terms of payment. She had read enough legal documents in her life to move through the language efficiently. She found the payment terms in the second paragraph of page 4. The upfront payment, the amount Meridian Energy Partners was prepared to pay to Dorothy Calloway as the registered owner of the mineral rights on the Route 9 parcel, was $380,000. Plus royalties. Per year! For 20 years. She stood very still at the workbench with the document in her hands, the morning light coming through the cabin's single window. At a low angle, the photograph of Frank laughing, resting against the open lockbox at her feet. $380,000 plus royalties per year for 20 years for the $1 cabin that wasn't worth tearing down. She looked at the sealed envelope with her name on the front in Frank's handwriting. Outside, the mist had begun to lift. The sky above the tree line was turning slowly towards something that might yet be a clear day. She picked up the envelope. She read the Meridian document once sitting on the cabin floor with her back against the workbench, and the morning light coming through the single window at a low, flat angle. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked it up and read it again. 22 pages. She read every one. Frank had been in private negotiation with Meridian Energy Partners since the spring of 2021, 2 years before he died. The 22.4 acres on Route 9, the unimproved rural land that the county had assessed at $6,200 and Victor had dismissed in 3 seconds, sat above a natural gas formation that a licensed geological survey team had identified and mapped in 2020. The formation was deep, substantial, and accessible. Meridian had been looking for a surface owner willing to negotiate a mineral rights lease. They had found Frank. He had not told Victor. He had not told Sylvia. He had not told Dorothy. What he had done, in the careful and methodical way he had done everything that mattered, was this. In May of 2021, he had quietly registered the mineral rights to the Route 9 parcel under Dorothy's name as sole owner. Then he had transferred the surface parcel to her via the nominal deed, the $1 deed, that Gerald Marsh had slid across the kitchen table like a footnote. Then he had continued the Meridian negotiation on her behalf as her designated agent, building it to final terms over 2 years of patient private work. He had never told her any of it. She sat on the concrete floor of the cabin he had kept for her and thought about the Saturday mornings he had driven out here alone, about the evenings she had seen the light on under his office door, about the quiet in him in those last years that she had read as the natural inward turning of a man in his 70s. She had thought he was making peace with things. He had been building something. She picked up the sealed envelope. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on the same cream paper he used for correspondence he considered important. His handwriting was smaller than it had been in earlier years, but no less precise, the handwriting of a man who had been writing things down carefully for a very long time and had not stopped being careful at the end. I know you're going to be angry that I didn't tell you. You're right to be. I thought about telling you many times. I would get as far as sitting down across from you at the kitchen table, and then I would think about what you would say, and I would already know how it would go. You would have said it was too much, that you didn't need it, that you'd be fine. You've been saying that for 31 years. Through every family dinner where Sylvia talked over you, through every holiday where Victor treated you like a guest in your own home, through every time one of them said something that landed like a stone, and you picked yourself up and said you'd be fine and meant it because you always mean what you say. I didn't want you to just be fine. I wanted you to be untouchable. Victor will take what the will gives him. I made peace with that a long time ago. He is my son, and I understand him, even the parts of him I cannot excuse. What the will gives him is real, and it is his. But he will not have this. I made sure of that before I registered a single document. This land, these rights, this negotiation, none of it ever touched the estate. It was yours from the moment I put your name on the mineral rights registration. I was simply the man sitting across the table from Meridian doing the work on your behalf, the way I should have been doing more work on your behalf for 31 years. I am sorry it took me this long to build something that couldn't be taken from you. You were never ordinary, Dot. I know they made you feel that way. I watched it happen, and I did not always say enough to stop it, and that is one of the few things in our life together I am not proud of. You were never background. You were never a footnote. You were the whole reason any of it was worth building in the first place. I am sorry I didn't say that out loud more often. I am saying it now. The attorney's name is at the back of the folder. She knows everything. Trust her. Frank. Dorothy read the letter through once without stopping. Then she set it down on the concrete beside the photograph. Frank laughing, the tree line behind him, the porch rail at the edge of the frame, and she sat with both of them for a while. She was not angry. She had thought she might be reading it, had thought the shape of his sentence about knowing what she would say might land with the slight sting of being known too well, of having your own habits used as a reason to be kept in the dark. But it didn't land that way. It landed the way truth lands when it is spoken with love rather than precision, when the person saying it is not scoring a point but offering an account. He had known her. He had known her completely the way you know someone after 31 years of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings, and every unremarkable Tuesday in between. And he had used that knowledge not to manage her, but to protect her, to build something solid enough that her own instinct to ask for less than she deserved could not diminish it. You were the whole reason any of it was worth building." She pressed the heels of her hands briefly against her eyes. Then she straightened her back and picked up the manila folder and found what was at the back: a business card. Patricia Wren, Estate and Property Law, the county seat address. And below the printed information in Frank's handwriting, a single line: "She knows everything. Trust her." And a phone number. Dorothy stood up from the cabin floor. Her knees registered the cold and the concrete, and she registered them right back the way a practical woman registers discomfort, acknowledged, noted, moved through. She picked up the letter, the photograph, and the Meridian document. She carried them to the workbench and set them in order. Then she called Patricia Wren. The phone rang once. Patricia answered on the second ring with the alert, unhurried quality of a woman who had been expecting a call and had not been watching the clock, but had also not been far from the phone. Dorothy identified herself. There was a brief pause, not surprise, but the pause of a person shifting from readiness into action. "Mrs. Calloway," Patricia said, "I've been expecting your call for about 3 weeks now. How are you holding up?" Dorothy looked at the photograph of Frank laughing on the workbench in front of her. She laughed. A short sound startled out of her, the kind of laugh that arrives before you have decided to laugh, surprised out of the body by something that is both sad and, against all reasonable expectation, exactly right. She said, "I'm better than I was an hour ago." Patricia was precise and unhurried in the way of someone who is prepared for a conversation and is not going to rush it simply because the other person has just had a significant morning. She confirmed what the Meridian document said. The negotiation was complete. Frank had brought it to final terms in January, 2 months before he died, in a series of meetings that Patricia had attended as Dorothy's legal representative, a designation Frank had established in writing in 2021. The lease was ready to execute. The numbers were exactly as the document stated: $380,000 up front, royalties on production per year for 20 years, all of it waiting for Dorothy's signature. But Patricia told her there was a complication. The moment Dorothy signed the lease, it became a matter of public record with the county. Meridian would file the executed agreement. The mineral rights registration already recorded in Dorothy's name since 2021, but quietly, without drawing attention, would become visible to anyone who looked. And Victor, Patricia said, would look. He would have someone looking the moment he heard the name Meridian. When he found it, he would almost certainly challenge the mineral rights registration. His argument would be that Frank had improperly separated the subsurface rights from the main estate, that the minerals should have passed through probate, along with the surface property and the other assets, and that registering them in Dorothy's name had been an end run around the estate plan. Dorothy listened to all of this without interrupting. She had spent 30 years receiving difficult information in clear language and had never believed that understanding a problem made it larger. It made it workable. She asked, "Can he win that argument?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of someone choosing how much to say and in what order. Then she said, "Frank prepared for this. He prepared for it specifically and in detail, and what he left me, if they challenge, will end this very quickly." Dorothy looked out the cabin's single window at the morning. The mist had lifted almost completely now. The tree line was clear, the sky beyond it a pale, clean blue. She asked, "What did he leave you?" Patricia Wren had been Frank Calloway's private estate attorney for 15 years. She had handled transactions he never discussed with his family, documents he had executed with the quiet deliberateness of a man who understood that the most important legal work is done long before it is ever needed. In March of 2021, Frank had come to her office and asked her to become the registered custodian of a document he had just executed, not a revision to his will, not an amendment to any existing estate plan. Something else entirely. Something that Frank had understood after 35 years of watching property disputes and estate challenges and families tear apart the things that people built with their lives, was the one document that could not be argued away once it existed. Patricia called it the floor. Whatever they throw at us, she told Dorothy that morning, they cannot go below the floor. Dorothy asked, "What is it?" "A declaration of intent," Patricia said. In Frank's own words, describing his reasons for registering the mineral rights in Dorothy's name, his reasons for structuring the cabin transfer, as he did his explicit intention that these assets pass to Dorothy outside of probate, and his full understanding of the legal implications of that choice. She paused. Signed, witnessed, and recorded with the county clerk in October 2022, 18 months before he died. When he was, and I want to be very precise about this, in perfect legal and cognitive health. I was present. The notary was present. A second attorney was present. Frank read every word aloud before he signed it. Dorothy stood very still in the cabin. "Victor can file anything he wants," Patricia said. "It won't matter." Outside in the tree line, the bird called again, the same one she had heard when she first arrived, or one like it. A single clear note in the quiet of the morning. Dorothy looked at the photograph on the workbench, at Frank laughing. She said, "When can we meet?" Patricia said, "I have time tomorrow, but Dorothy, take today. Read everything again. Let it settle. You've had a significant morning." Dorothy looked around the cabin at the tools on the wall, at the 2 folding chairs, at the clean workbench, and the open lockbox in the floor, and the spread of documents that Frank had spent 3 years assembling for this exact moment. She said, "He really thought of everything, didn't he?" Patricia said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite professional distance. "He really did. He talked about you when we worked on this. He wanted to make sure I understood who I was working for." Dorothy didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "What did he say?" Patricia said he said you were the most practical person he had ever known, and that when you found all of this, you would probably read everything twice before you let yourself feel anything about it. Dorothy looked at the Meridian document on the workbench, the letter, the photograph. She said he was right about the reading twice. She heard Patricia smile through the phone. "Tomorrow," Patricia said. "My office, 10 o'clock. Dorothy said I'll be there." She ended the call. She stood for another moment in the cabin that Frank had kept for her on the 22.4 acres above a natural gas formation that Victor had waved away in 3 seconds with a sealed letter in her hand and a photograph of her husband laughing and $380,000 and 20 years of royalties waiting for her signature. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it and the photograph and the Meridian document back into the manila folder. She tucked the folder under her arm. Then she closed the lockbox, turned off the light, and walked out into the clear March morning. Dorothy signed the Meridian lease on a Wednesday morning in Patricia's office. The office was quiet and orderly in the way of a place where serious work happens without performance. No artwork chosen to impress, no furniture that announced itself, just good light and clean surfaces, and the particular stillness of a room where important things had been decided without drama for many years. Patricia set the document in front of her, turned to the signature page, and handed her a pen without ceremony. Dorothy read the signature page carefully before she signed it. Old habit. Patricia watched her do it and did not rush her, which told Dorothy something about Patricia that she had already suspected from their phone call, that this was a woman Frank had chosen well. She signed her name, Dorothy Ann Calloway. The same signature she had written on nursing intake forms and insurance documents and the deed to a cabin on a dirt road that nobody had visited in years. Patricia signed as witness. The notary sealed it. That was all. Patricia filed it with the county recorder's office that Thursday afternoon. Dorothy was not present for the filing. She was at Jean's house eating lunch, doing the ordinary things that fill ordinary days, while important documents make their way through county systems and become quietly and irrevocably matters of public record. By Friday morning, the filing was visible on the public database. By Friday afternoon, Victor knew. Dorothy's phone rang at 4:17. She was sitting at Jean's kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the cabin deed which she had taken to keeping nearby, the way some people keep a photograph, not because she needed to look at it constantly, but because its physical presence was a form of reassurance. Jean was across the table, shelling early peas from the garden with the focused calm of a woman who has learned that keeping her hands busy is the best way to manage her nerves on someone else's behalf. Dorothy looked at the screen, picked up the phone, answered. Victor's voice was controlled. He had the tight, precise quality of a man who is angry and has decided to remain professional about it, which gave every word a clipped, compressed energy, like something held under pressure. He asked if she understood what she had signed. Dorothy said yes. He said the mineral rights had been part of the estate. He said they should have passed through probate along with the surface property. He said the 2021 registration was improper, an asset transfer made outside the estate plan, without proper disclosure, and that he intended to challenge it. Dorothy had thought about what she would say when this call came. She had sat with it, turned it over, considered several versions. In the end, she had decided, as she usually decided, on the plainest possible version of the truth. She said the mineral rights were registered in my name in May of 2021, 2 years before Frank died. I think you should call Patricia Wren before you decide what you intend to do. She hung up. Jeanne looked at her from across the table without speaking. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to go long and gold across the backyard. Dorothy set the phone down and exhaled once a single slow breath, the kind that carries something out of the body that has been held there too long. Then she said he sounded exactly the way he sounded in 2002, when Frank got us the lake house instead of giving them the money. That same voice. Jean set down her bowl of peas. What happened in 2002? Dorothy looked at the cabin deed on the table. Frank held his ground, she said, the way he always did. Quietly, without making a scene, without giving anyone a target to aim at. He just held it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said I can do that too. Jean reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Dorothy's. Then she picked up her peas again, which was, Dorothy thought, exactly the right thing to do. Victor moved quickly. He always moved quickly. It was his primary mode of operation, the thing that had served him well in property development, and that had, in this case, led him to dismiss a $1 cabin without reading the deed closely enough. He retained a litigation attorney by Friday evening. By Monday morning, Patricia had received a formal letter. The letter claimed that the 2021 mineral rights registration constituted fraudulent conveyance and improper transfer of an asset made with the intent to deprive the estate of its value. It cited the relevant statute. It requested that the Meridian lease be suspended pending legal review and that the mineral rights registration be contested in probate court. Dorothy read the letter when Patricia sent it to her. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, and she recognized that it was not frivolous. Fraudulent conveyance was a real legal argument. It required a real response. Victor had found the one angle that had actual legal weight, and he had moved to it within 48 hours of the public filing. She called Patricia. Patricia's voice, when she answered, had the quality of a person who is not rattled and does not need to perform being not rattled because the distinction is genuine. She said, I've read it. This is exactly what Frank prepared for. I'm going to send them one document in response. After that, I expect the filing will be withdrawn within 10 business days. Dorothy asked what document. Patricia said Frank's declaration of intent, the one recorded with the county clerk in October 2022. She paused. I want to give you some context about what's in it, she said before Victor's attorney reads it and before you hear about it secondhand. Frank was thorough. He documented his full rationale, the geological assessment, the timeline of the Meridian negotiation, his legal reasoning for separating the mineral rights from the surface estate, and his explicit statement that the transfer was a deliberate gift made with complete knowledge of its potential value. She paused again. He also included one paragraph, she said, that I think you should read yourself. I'll send you the full document this evening. Dorothy asked, Is it the kind of paragraph that explains something? Patricia said, It explains everything. I think when you read it, a number of things that may have felt unresolved will feel less so. Patricia's email arrived at 7:43 that evening. Dorothy opened it at Jean's kitchen table under the overhead light with a cup of tea cooling at her elbow that she had made and then forgotten about entirely. The declaration was 14 pages. Frank's voice was in every paragraph, not the warm, private voice of the birthday card or the letter from the lockbox, but the precise, methodical voice of a man who had spent 35 years constructing documents designed to withstand scrutiny. He had written it the way he wrote everything professional, clearly, completely, without leaving gaps. He documented the geological survey and how he had come to commission it. He documented his first contact with Meridian and the timeline of the negotiation. He documented his legal reasoning for registering the mineral rights separately from the surface estate, citing precedent, citing statute, citing the specific provisions that made the separation valid. He documented his decision to place everything in Dorothy's name, and his understanding that this decision would be questioned, and his deliberate choice to make that questioning as difficult as possible by recording his intent while he was in perfect legal and cognitive health. Every page was meticulous. Every decision was documented and justified. Reading it was like watching Frank work the same careful, unhurried thoroughness she had seen when he spread property surveys across the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, tracing lot lines with his finger, explaining things to her that she had listened to with more attention than he probably realized. She reached page 12 at 8:15. The paragraph was set apart from the material before and after it by white space, as if Frank had understood that it needed room to exist without being crowded by the formal language surrounding it. It was not citation. It was not legal reasoning. It was simply Frank writing in the only register that had always been more difficult for him than any professional document, the personal one. She read it. I have been married to Dorothy Ann Calloway for 31 years. In that time, I have watched her ask for less than she deserved, with such grace that people mistook it for having no claim at all. I have watched my son treat her patience as weakness and her quietness as permission. I have not always corrected him as firmly as I should have. This declaration is in part my correction. I intend the Route 9 mineral rights, the surface parcel, and all future benefits arising from them to belong to Dorothy alone, not as compensation for what she endured, because no document can compensate a life, but as acknowledgement of what she was, in mine, not an addition, not a guest, not a late chapter, but the woman for whom I built the only estate that ever mattered. She read it a second time. Then she set her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, at the plain white ceiling of her sister's kitchen, at the ordinary overhead light, at the unremarkable surface of a room where she had been living a temporary life for weeks while she waited to understand what came next. She understood now. Not just the documents, not just the mineral rights and the Meridian negotiation and the 3 years of patient private work, but the silence. The Saturday mornings he had driven out to Route 9 alone, the evenings with the light on under the office door, the birthday card with its quiet instruction, the way he had looked at her sometimes in those last years, the expression she had read as the natural gravity of a man getting older, but that she understood now had been something else entirely. The expression of a man carrying something he had decided to carry alone until he could lay it down properly. He had waited because he had wanted it to be complete before she found it. He had said nothing because saying something would have meant watching her carry the knowledge of it, the weight of being planned for, protected, prepared for, through the years he had hoped they still had. He had wanted those years to be ordinary. He had wanted her to have the mornings and the dinners and the Sundays with the paper, without the shadow of what he was building falling over them. And he had left her a $1 cabin on a dirt road because he had known with the complete unsentimental clarity of a man who had spent 35 years understanding what land was worth and what people overlooked, that the one thing Victor would never look at twice was the thing that couldn't be taken from her. She picked up her tea. It had gone completely cold. She drank it anyway. Patricia sent the declaration to Victor's litigation attorney on a Tuesday morning by certified email, with read receipt the way documents are sent when the sender wants a precise record of the moment they arrived. Dorothy knew the timeline. Patricia had walked her through it, the 48-hour review window Victor's attorney had requested, the likely interpretations of that request, the specific weight that a county-recorded document carried in a challenge proceeding. Dorothy had listened to all of it, and then gone back to Jean's house and done what she had always done when there was nothing to do but wait. She had made herself useful. She had cooked dinner. She had helped Jean with the garden. She had slept not well but adequately, the way a woman sleeps when she has done what she can and has learned over 67 years that worrying through the night does not change what morning brings. Jian, who had been reading over Dorothy's shoulder when she reached page 12, had not said anything for a full minute after she finished. Dorothy had watched her sister's face move through something without speaking. Jean was not a woman who needed to fill silence, which had always been one of the things Dorothy loved most about her. Then Jean said he always knew Dot. He always knew exactly what you were worth. Dorothy looked at the paragraph one more time. Then she folded the page carefully along its original crease and put it in her coat pocket. The cabin deed was already there. She had been carrying it every day since she found it, the way you carry something that has changed the shape of things. The folded page settled beside it. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the paragraph had not already said better than she could. She called Patricia the next morning. She asked, "Did you know he wrote that?" Patricia said, "Yes. He asked me to read it before he filed it. I told him it was the most legally unusual thing I had ever notarized." A pause. "I also told him it was the most honest," Dorothy said. "What did he say when you told him that?" Patricia said he should have written it 30 years ago, and then he signed it. Dorothy stood at Jean's kitchen window and looked out at the backyard and the oak tree, which was further into bud now than it had been when she arrived, the tips of the branches gone soft and faintly green with the first real suggestion of spring. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." Patricia called on the afternoon of the second day. Her voice had the precise, measured quality Dorothy had come to recognize as Patricia's version of controlled anticipation, not excitement, but the focused alertness of a woman tracking something that is moving in a specific direction. Victor's litigation attorney had called. The conversation had been brief. He had said he needed 48 hours to review the declaration. Patricia had said, of course, standard, professional, the kind of exchange that reveals almost nothing on its surface and almost everything underneath. Patricia said, "When a litigation attorney asks for 48 hours after receiving a filing, it usually means one of two things. He is preparing to escalate or he is preparing to withdraw." Dorothy asked, "Which do you think it is?" Patricia said the declaration was county filed 18 months before Frank's death. It is public record. It was executed with a notary and a second attorney present. The competency is unimpeachable. If Victor challenges it, a judge will read page 12 in open court. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would that be a problem?" Patricia said, "For Dorothy Calloway, no." A pause. "For Victor, I imagine it would be deeply uncomfortable." Dorothy said, "I see." Patricia said, "I thought you might." The call came on hour 47 of the 48-hour window. Dorothy's phone showed Victor's personal number, not his attorney's office, not a Nashville area code she didn't recognize. Victor himself. She looked at it for one ring. Then she answered. His voice was different. She noticed it immediately. The compressed, pressurized quality was gone, the professional control that had characterized every interaction since the Tuesday he had arrived at the house with his folder and his notary. What was there instead was quieter. Not soft exactly, but quieter. The voice of a man who has been reading something for 2 days and has arrived somewhere he did not expect to arrive. He asked one question, "Did you know he was doing all this?" Dorothy said no. A pause, longer than she expected. "Victor said he never told me either, about any of it." She waited. She had learned in 30 years of nursing that the most important thing a person could do in certain moments was to leave space for what was trying to come forward. You did not fill it. You did not hurry it. You simply held the space open and let the other person find their way into it or not. Victor said, "I need to think." He hung up. Dorothy held the phone for a moment after the call ended. The kitchen was quiet around her. Through the window, the late afternoon light was the particular warm gold of an April evening, the kind of light that makes everything look like a version of itself that is slightly more worth keeping. She thought about Victor at 17, watching his mother's life contract after the divorce, the money gone, the house gone, the future his parents had built together divided and reassigned, while he was still young enough for it to become the story he told himself about the world. She thought about 30 years of that story, hardening, calcifying, becoming the lens through which he had seen Dorothy from the beginning. Not a person, an explanation for what he had lost. She did not excuse it, but she understood it the way a nurse understands the behavior of someone in pain, not as acceptable, but as legible, as human, as the kind of thing that requires more than anything someone willing to read it accurately. Frank had read it accurately. Frank had known his son's wound and had tried, in the document he filed 18 months before his death, to do what he had not always done while he was alive, to say clearly for the record in language that could not be misread what was true. Victor Calloway Jr. had spent 30 years in real estate development. He understood documents. He understood intent. He understood the weight of a county-recorded declaration and exactly what it meant in a challenge proceeding. But sitting at his desk with 14 pages of his father's words in front of him, page 12, visible under the lamp, he had understood something else for the first time. His father had not protected Dorothy Calloway instead of loving his children. His father had protected Dorothy Calloway because no one else ever had, and because Frank had understood with the patient clarity of a man who had watched his own family for 30 years that his son, in grief, moving fast, looking only at what was directly in front of him, would become someone he did not want to be, and had decided quietly to make it impossible. Victor called his attorney at 9:14 the next morning. The challenge was withdrawn by noon. The title company was in a low brick building on the main street of the county seat, 3 doors down from a hardware store and across from a bank that had been there since Dorothy was a girl. She had driven past it dozens of times over the years without ever having a reason to go inside. She went inside alone. Patricia had offered to accompany her. Dorothy had said she would rather do this part herself. Patricia had understood the way she seemed to understand most things about Dorothy without requiring an explanation. The closing officer was a woman named Ruth. Not Jean, not her Ruth, but a different one. A woman about Dorothy's age with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the unhurried competence of someone who has facilitated hundreds of these transactions and treats each one with the same steady attention. She had the blue folder on the table when Dorothy sat down and a pen already uncapped. They went through it page by page, 17 pages. Dorothy read each one before she signed. She always read before she signed, and she was not going to stop now, not today, not for this. Ruth did not rush her. She sat across the table and waited with the patient ease of a woman accustomed to people who take documents seriously. The final page was the payment authorization. $380,000 to be wired to a new account in the name of Dorothy Ann Calloway at the First County Bank account number ending in the 4 digits Dorothy had chosen herself the previous week, standing at a bank counter with a folder of documents and the particular feeling of a person doing something for the first time that she should perhaps have done years ago. She signed it. Ruth collected the pages, aligned them, and slid them into the blue folder with the efficient care of someone who understands that a piece of paper can change a life and treats it accordingly. She held the folder out across the table. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway." Dorothy took the folder. She looked at it for a moment, the plain blue cover, her name on the tab, the weight of 17 pages that had taken 3 years to build and 45 minutes to execute. "She said my husband did this. I just showed up." Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that arrives without being prepared. That's what a good marriage looks like from the outside. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Then she put the folder in her bag next to the cabin deed and the folded page 12 and stood up and thanked her and walked out into the April morning. Patricia was parked 2 doors down. She had said she would wait, and she had. They drove without much conversation for a few miles the way 2 people drive when something significant has just happened, and neither of them needs to fill the space with words. Then Patricia turned into the parking lot of a diner on the edge of town, a small place the kind with vinyl booths and a coffee counter and a pie case that rotates slowly near the register, and looked at Dorothy. Dorothy said yes. They took a booth by the window. The coffee came quickly. Outside, the main road moved with the ordinary Tuesday traffic of a county seat on a spring morning. Patricia wrapped her hands around her mug. Then she said, "There's something I haven't told you yet. I've been waiting for the right moment, and I think this is it." Dorothy waited. Patricia said Frank came to my office alone in October 2022, the day he filed the declaration. He had signed everything the notary had left, and he sat across from me in that office and asked me one question. She paused. He asked if something happens to me and Dorothy doesn't find the cabin documents for a year or 2 years, does the Meridian offer stay valid? Dorothy set down her coffee cup. Patricia said I confirmed that the negotiated terms would remain open as long as you were the registered owner. Meridian had every incentive to wait. The formation wasn't going anywhere. Frank nodded. He sat with that for a moment. And then he said, she looked at Dorothy steadily. He said, good, she'll find it when she's ready. The diner moved around them, a plate set down somewhere, a brief exchange at the counter, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a place where people come for coffee and don't think too much about what the person in the next booth might be carrying. Dorothy looked out the window for a moment. Then she said quietly, he knew I might wait. Patricia said he knew you might need time. Dorothy thought about the weeks at Jean's house, the shower where she cried, and the kitchen table where she functioned, the county property record showing a $6,000 assessment, the 4 numbers on the notepad that Jean had looked at over her shoulder and called a lockbox combination, the morning drive to Route 9 before sunrise. Frank had planned for all of it, had built enough time into the architecture of what he left her that even her own patience, her own willingness to move slowly to wait until she was ready to not ask for things, until she fully understood what she was asking for, could not have worked against her. He had known her completely, and he had built around what he knew. She picked up her coffee and held it in both hands and did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing to say that felt equal to what she was feeling, and she had long ago made her peace with that particular kind of fullness. Sylvia called 2 days later. Dorothy saw the name on the screen and felt not dread exactly, but the slight bracing of a person preparing for weather. She answered without hesitation. Sylvia's voice was different from any version of it Dorothy had heard in 31 years. The Polish was still there. Sylvia was constitutionally incapable of carelessness, but the cold beneath the polish was gone, or at least was not present in the same way. What was there instead was the stiffness of a person who is attempting something unfamiliar and is doing it anyway. She said, I owe you something. I don't know what exactly, but I owe you something. Dorothy said, you don't owe me anything, Sylvia. You were protecting your family. I understand that. A silence, the kind that has weight. Then Sylvia said, Frank loved you very much. Dorothy said, I know he did. Another silence, shorter. Then Sylvia said, I don't think I made it easy for him to show it. Around us. Dorothy did not say yes and did not say no. She let the sentence stand where Sylvia had placed it, which seemed like the right thing to do. They did not speak for long. The call ended without resolution and without hostility, which was Dorothy thought probably the most that could be asked of a first conversation of that kind. Some distances close slowly, some close in stages, one careful step at a time, with long pauses between. She was willing to be patient about that. She had practice. Patricia called that afternoon. She said, there's one more thing. I've been holding it because I wanted to wait until the legal matters were settled. I didn't want it to get tangled up with everything else. Dorothy listened. Frank had called Patricia's office line in January of the year he died, not to discuss a document or a filing or a legal question. He had called and asked Patricia if she could keep a personal message in her records, something for Dorothy if she ever needed to hear his voice. He had left a 2-minute voicemail. Patricia said, I have it. It's been saved and backed up. It's not going anywhere. I want you to know it exists, and I want you to know that you can hear it whenever you're ready. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She said, not today. Patricia said, of course. Dorothy said, maybe not for a while. Patricia said, it will be here whenever you're ready. There's no timeline. Dorothy thanked her and set the phone down and sat for a moment in Jean's kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window and the blue folder from the closing on the table in front of her and the coat on the chair with the deed and the folded page in the pocket. His voice, 2 minutes of it saved on a machine in a lawyer's office waiting. She was not ready yet, but she would be. She knew herself well enough to know that. There would come a morning not soon, but eventually the way all things that needed time eventually arrived, when she would drive to Patricia's office and sit down across the desk and say, "I'm ready now." And Patricia would play it, and she would hear him. "Not today. That evening she drove back to Route 9. She parked in the same place at the end of the dirt track in the last of the daylight. She walked the overgrown path to the cabin door. She put her hand on the weathered wood, the boards gray, with weather the tin roof going rust at the edges, the brush grown up thick on two sides. She stood there for a while without going in. 22 acres around her gone quiet, in the way that rural land goes quiet at the end of a day, the particular deep stillness of open ground, settling into evening, the tree line dark against the pale sky, a single bird, moving somewhere in the pines. Beneath it all, far below the surface, a natural gas formation that a geological survey had mapped, and a patient man had spent 3 years turning into something that could not be taken from her. She thought about Frank driving out here on weekend mornings while she slept, taking the dirt track in the early light, sitting in one of those folding chairs, thinking about what he was building and for whom, and how to make sure it held. She thought about him doing all of it alone in the way he had always done the things that mattered most to him quietly, without announcement, without asking for acknowledgement, carrying it until it was ready to be set down. She opened the door. She went inside. She sat down in one of the folding chairs and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the workbench and the tools on the wall and the open lockbox in the floor empty now, its contents safely elsewhere. She stayed until it got dark. 6 weeks after the closing, Dorothy made a decision. She was sitting at Jean's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late March with her coffee and the blue folder and the quarterly royalty schedule Patricia had sent over, and she looked at the numbers on the page, and then looked out the window at Jean's backyard and the oak tree which was fully in bud, now the branches gone soft and green with spring, and she thought, I am not going back to that house. Not to fight for it, not to negotiate for it, not to ask Victor for anything that required his agreement. She had the Meridian funds. She had 22.4 acres on a dirt road in the county where she had lived for 31 years. She had a geological formation beneath her feet and a quarterly royalty schedule and a lawyer who answered on the second ring. She called Patricia that afternoon. She said, I want to build something on the Route 9 land, a real structure, small, practical, good windows, a proper kitchen, something that belongs there. Patricia said, I know a contractor who does good work and doesn't overcharge. Dorothy said, that's exactly what I need. The contractor was a man named Ellis who had been building things in the county for 30 years and had the quiet, methodical manner of someone who takes pride in work that outlasts the conversation about it. He walked the land with Dorothy on a cold morning in early April, the two of them moving through the scrub grass and old trees with the focused attention of people assessing what a place could become. He asked her what she wanted. She said simple, warm, windows that face east for the morning light, a kitchen where I can actually cook, a porch. He said, how big? She said, big enough, not bigger. He understood. Some people do. The build took 6 weeks. Dorothy spent part of that time at Jean's and part of it at a small rental in town, close enough to drive out to the land every few days and watch the structure take shape, the framing first, then the walls, then the roof going on over a long weekend when Ellis had his full crew out. She brought coffee for the crew on those mornings without being asked. They accepted it without making a fuss, which she appreciated. She moved in on a Thursday in April when the trees on the property had gone fully green, and the scrub grass had softened into something that looked in the afternoon light almost like a meadow. She unpacked her 2 bags for the last time. She hung her clothes in the new closet. She put her mother's quilt on the bed. She set her coffee mug on the kitchen shelf, the blue one with the chip on the handle, 12 years old, still useful. Then she hung the photograph. She had chosen the wall opposite the front door, the first thing you saw when you walked in. Frank laughing the original cabin behind him, the tree line at the edge of the frame. That unguarded version of him that she had been the keeper of for 31 years, printed and placed and preserved in a lockbox floor for her to find. She stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then she went outside and started on the garden. She planted in the practical way. She did everything, no romanticizing, just good soil preparation and sensible choices for the zone and the light. Tomatoes along the south-facing edge, herbs near the kitchen window, a row of beans that would need staking later. She worked in the mornings before the day got warm with the particular focused pleasure of physical work done in good air on land that was hers. She did not take Victor to court. She did not issue a statement. She did not call Sylvia back to finish a conversation that had already said what it needed to say. She did not demand anything from the family that had spent 31 years tolerating her and 6 weeks trying to leave her with nothing. She simply lived on her land and her home with the royalty payments arriving every quarter into an account that bore only her name. She paid her taxes. She tended her garden. She had Patricia to dinner once a month and Jean every Sunday, and occasionally on Saturday mornings she drove to a different part of the property and walked the tree line the way Frank must have walked it slowly, without agenda, just to know the shape of the place. Patricia came by one afternoon in May unannounced with a bottle of wine and a small card. Dorothy saw the car coming up the dirt track and went to the porch to meet her. Patricia got out with the wine in one hand and the card in the other and looked at the new cabin and the garden and the full green of the property in spring and said nothing for a moment. Then she said Frank would have liked this. Dorothy said, "I think he planned on it." They sat on the porch with the wine while the afternoon light moved across the 22 acres and the trees made their quiet sounds in the light wind. After a while, Patricia handed her the card. Dorothy opened it. One line handwritten in Patricia's precise script. He was right. You were always smarter than they gave you credit for. Dorothy looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Patricia. She said, "Did he tell you to write that?" Patricia smiled, a full, unhurried smile, the kind she did not produce in professional settings. She said, "He told me a lot of things." Dorothy looked back at the card. Frank's birthday card from last year from the folder she had brought with her in the paper bag of kitchen items. Almost the same words. Not a coincidence. Frank telling Patricia what to say for the moment he had known or hoped would eventually arrive. She set the card on the porch railing and picked up her wine and looked out at the land. Victor had contacted Patricia in early May, not to file anything, not to argue. The call was brief, and Patricia told Dorothy noticeably different in quality from the previous ones, quieter, stripped of the professional armor he usually wore so naturally it seemed like skin. He had asked whether there was any record of his father intending to leave him anything personal. Not financial. Personal. Patricia had checked her files carefully. She had found one item logged in Frank's records in the same session as the declaration, a sealed letter for Victor to be delivered at Patricia's discretion in the event of Frank's death. She had sent it. Victor called Dorothy 1 week later. She was in the garden when the phone rang her hands in the soil, and she pulled off one glove and answered without looking at the screen first. They spoke for 11 minutes. She never told anyone what he said. Neither did he. Jean asked once carefully, and Dorothy said only it was enough, which Jean understood to mean exactly what it said. Not that everything was resolved, not that 30 years of distance had closed in 11 minutes, but that something had been said that needed saying, and that it had landed, and that the rest was a matter of time and patience, and the slow, unglamorous work of two people deciding what kind of family they intended to be. Dorothy was willing to be patient about that. She had practice. She cleaned the old lockbox herself one Saturday morning in late May, brought it up from the floor of the original cabin with a screwdriver and some patience, and set it on the porch with a cloth and a tin of metal polish, and worked on it for an hour until the steel came clean and the hinges moved without resistance. She placed it on a shelf in the main room of the new cabin near the window that faced east, where the morning light would find it. Open, empty. The velvet lining of a document safe that had held its secret for 3 years and had given it up exactly when it was meant to. She stood back and looked at it beside the photograph of Frank laughing. 2 things he had left her, one locked, one open, both exactly what he had intended. Victor Calloway had spent 30 years knowing what land was worth. He had looked at 22.4 acres of overgrown brush on a dirt road and seen nothing. That was not his fault exactly. He had been looking at the wrong thing. He had been looking at the land. Frank Calloway had been looking at Dorothy. He had watched her for 31 years absorb every slight, every dismissal, every polite exclusion, and give back nothing but steadiness. He had watched his family mistake her patience for weakness and her quietness for permission. He had not always corrected them as firmly as he should have. He had known that. He had written it down, and he had thought, when I am gone, this woman will be fine. She has always been fine. She will pack her bags and find somewhere to land and make the best of whatever is left and say it's enough because that is who she is. I don't want her to be fine. I want her to be free. So he had found her something no one would bother to steal, something assessed at $6,000 and dismissed in 3 seconds by a man who prided himself on knowing value, something ordinary, something forgotten, a $1 cabin on a dirt road that nobody had visited in years. He had put everything inside it. He had locked it, and he had waited patiently the way he did everything that mattered for her to find the key.